Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our fifth talk on the export-led growth model in Latin America in the late 19th century. Our speaker today is Ivan Luzardo Luna. He is the Barry Postdoctoral Fellow at the Department of Economics at the University of Pennsylvania. So please, Ivan.
Thank you very much, Fernando. So let me share my screen. So can you see my presentation? Okay, perfect. So thank you very much. Today I'm going to talk about the export-led growth model or period. I think that this period is particularly important in Latin American history because, I mean, it's an oversimplification, but we can describe this period like the transition from the pre-modern economic period, so basically a period when we have no economic growth at all, toward modern economic growth. So basically the origin of economic growth in Latin America, we can allocate that process in this period. And as you can infer from the title, a substantial part of that growth is explained by the development in the exporting sector. So this is why we call this period in general the framework of this this period that we can basically describe like the export growth model, because we have economic growth and a substantial share of that growth is explained by international trade, and we will see that it was not just international trade but a deeper integration into the world economy. So I would like to start bringing your attention to the next two slides where I show you two pictures from Santiago de Chile. So this is the Santiago main square, Plaza de Armas, the oldest part of Santiago de Chile. And we have this picture from the middle of the 19th century. So in the mid 19th century, so 1850, we can see that Santiago de Chile is essentially a city proper from the colonial period. So you can see that the construction, the building, everything is quite rustic. See, for instance, the roof. See, for instance, the height of the buildings, and also notice that basically we have no steam power yet in transportation. So you can see that basically we have carriage still. If we contrast Santiago de Chile from the mid 19th century with the city from the early 20th century, so that city is completely different. So in a matter of 70 years, so we can see how Santiago changed, so how Santiago evolved from essentially a colonial city toward a modern city. So here you can see the construction is different. So the road, the pavement, you can see steam powered transportation, tramways. So the whole city is different. And I think that this is a good illustration of the change that Latin America saw on this period. So it was essentially a good way how you can see the origin of modern economic growth in Latin America. So we will try to explain that transformation, that transition from stagnation toward growth. So don't take me wrong. So I am not saying that there was no period of prosperity before in Latin America, but the main difference between modern economic growth and the pre-modern period is essentially that after in the modern economic growth, so we can see persistent a permanent increase in the income per capita in countries that experienced that transformation. So basically, when I am talking that we can describe this period like the takeoff in Latin America economic history. So basically, I am saying that from that point onwards, we will start to see permanent and persistent economic growth. So this is the outline for our lecture today. So first, we'll talk a little bit of theory or the I mean the explanation behind the convergence or the catching up process, and we will briefly describe how, in the case of Latin America, that economic growth or that the transformation is strongly associated with the first wave of globalization. We an important difference between the first wave globalization in the case of Western Europe and the case of Latin America is that in the case of Latin America, we can assume that the first wave of globalization went until the Great Depression. Essentially, that process started in the late 19th century and lasted up to 1929, essentially up to the Great Depression. Unlike what happened in Western Europe, that usually we assume that the first wave of globalization started in the late 19th century as well, but ended in 1914 with the First World War. So after discuss the theory behind this, we will explore the potential mechanism, how the development in the global economy affected Latin America. So basically, we want to explain how globalization have an impact on Latin America. So we can think that that occurred via three different channels. So we have three potential mechanisms to explain the impact of globalization on Latin America. So the first of this channel is international trade. So basically, an economy is integrated with the rest or with the global economy via international trade, exporting or and importing. But also, an economy could be integrated with the global economy via the financial sector. So it's not just about exporting, it's also that during this period we will see capital flows from one country into other countries. So the financial integration is also important during this period. And finally, we'll talk about the labor market and also the integration in terms of people mobility. And we will see how the first wave of globalization have an impact on mobility, on people mobility via migration. So we will see how that process evolved in the case of Latin America. Until here, so basically we have talked about the demand side or how the global economy have an impact on Latin America. But I also wanted to emphasize that this was not just about sporting. So it was not just about integration into the world economy. Something structural also changed in the case of Latin America. So there was something also more fundamental, more structural. And we can describe that as a higher level of political centralization in the late 19th century. So we'll see an important institutional change here. So that institutional change is that you have a substantial decline in conflicts, in civil wars. So still we have wars, but the intensity of the conflict is substantially lower than that of the early 19th century. So in the previous week, so we thought essentially about how complicated the national bidding process was. But here in the late 19th century, we can essentially assume that that process essentially was ended. So at the end of the 19th century, so you had that the new countries were finally consolidated, and it was essentially the end of the nation building process. So again, so this is an oversimplification. So every country have a different path, a different trajectory. The intensity of the change were different, but just as to have a roadmap, I think that would be a good description. So let's start by the catching up the export-led growth model. So more the theory and also the some relevant facts that we need to consider to analyze this period. And the first point to consider is that in the late 19th century, so we are talking about a region and a group of countries that have a substantial income gap regarding the developed or the industrialized countries. So between the industrial leader of the world, at the time we can assume that is Britain, and Latin American countries, there is a substantial income gap. Why? Because in the early 19th century, industrialization started in Britain. So Britain started to grow, have an important development throughout the 19th century. That didn't happen in the case of Latin America. And so it was because of that reason. So we have an important income gap. But in the late 19th century, so we will see that the so-called the takeoff, basically this transition that we described before, like the like the movement from economic stagnation, or if you want the Malthusian period where you have no economic growth at all, toward modern economic growth, occurred in this period. So it was in the late 19th century. We started with a substantial income gap, but at the same time, we have the economic takeoff. So we started to see a persistent economic growth in Latin America. That occurred in the whole continent. That occurred in, basically, we see economic growth essentially in every country in this period between the late 19th century and the 1920s. But there is also important difference, substantial difference between countries. So we essentially see that economic growth was particularly strong in the case of the southern countries. We will see that countries like Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay, on average, have a better performance than the rest of the continent. Another important characteristic that we need to consider, or we need to bear in mind in order to understand this period, is that the sporting sector was important. So this is why we call this sport growth. But a substantial share, we say that most of the export that we serve during this period are essentially commodities. So commodities played an important role, and we will see that Latin American economies not just specialize in exporting commodities, but in exporting few commodities. So we will see that in most cases, we can identify 2-3 commodities that accounted for more of export of these countries. That doesn't mean that we have no industrialization. We will see in 1 minute that there is some developments in that way, but the manufacturing or the industrial sector essentially couldn't compete at international level. So we have a manufacturing sector that essentially focused on internal markets. And the late 19th century, so at global level, so again, so this is the period of the first wave of globalization. But just to bear in mind that in the case of Latin America, we can essentially assume that globalization went up to the late 20s, essentially up to the Great Depression. So in Western Europe, if we analyze the global economic history, so we usually assume that the tipping point in the transition from globalization toward deglobalization proper from the interwar period occurred in 1914. It was essentially a result or an outcome of the First World War. But in the case of Latin America, so that the economic integration lasted up to the late 20s. Okay, so I mentioned it. So commodities are essential to understand what is going on here, but it was not just about commodities. So it was not just about international trade, as I mentioned it before. So we have additional challenge how global economy could have an impact on Latin American economies. We will talk also about financial integration. So foreign investment is also another important point to consider in this transition. We will see that initially British investment in the 1920s, the American investment was essential to railroads construction in Latin America, to infrastructure improvement. And also we need to consider migration, so labor inflows that increased during this period of the late 19th century is also another point to consider. There is an important debate in the between scholars and in the literature about when industrialization started in Latin America. So we usually describe, or we usually associate this period with exporting large volume of commodities. So basically, there is a hyper concentration in the primary sector. But other authors, there is a very influential chapter by Salbushin from 2008 that basically maintains that the early stage of industrialization started also during this period. The reason why manufacturing is not usually associated with this transition or with this period of the export growth is it was because manufacturing sector was not so relevant in the export basket. So basically, manufacturing just competed at a local level or a national level in the case of Latin America. But this is something important because we will see that that early stage of industrialization will be relevant for the 20th century. But I think that is another element to consider. And finally, I think that when we try to understand the fundamental reasons behind this change, behind this transition from stagnation toward a more economic growth, I think that we need to examine also the institutional side of this story. So as I mentioned at the beginning, so what we will see is an improvement in terms of stability, but at the same time, we will see some problems in that institutional evolution. And that probably is essentially that we don't see the same increase in other um, in other in other sizes or in other areas of the institutional framework that a country need to have a political framework consistent with long-run economic growth. And essentially, what we will see is that there was a centralization of power, but at the same time, there were few constraints on the executive. So we will see that institutional improvement basically standing somewhere in between between an authoritarian regime and a full democracy. But we will explore that part at the of the lecture. But nevertheless, it's important to consider that we have more stability, we have a decline in civil wars, and also we have an increase in state capacity. Essentially, we can see that revenues via taxation increased in this period in most of Latin American countries. I think that this period is not just relevant for historians, it's not just relevant for economic historians, but I think that it's also relevant for for the literature in economics. So basically, we have a discussion in the literature about growth, about the reason of the drivers for convergence, or why some countries are able to converge, or basically to close their income gaps relative to developed economies, and why that just not happen in most of countries. So we have all the discussion about convergence and about conditional convergence. Also, we have a few examples of convergence in the most recent period. There are a few examples like South Korea, Ireland, but what we'll see is that it's no a trend that we can identify for most of countries, at least in the 20th century. So I think that it's a mean Latin American during this period also could have a contribution to the discussion, because with all the limitation, these countries have some economic convergence during this period. So I think that it's a meaning the Latin American cases could be relevant to understand the barriers to economic growth. So in a more theoretical way, trying to think about the reasons or the constraints to economic growth. So we have this very influential article by Abramovich published in the Journal of Economic History in the 80s, that he basically tried to understand the reasons behind catching up, behind convergence, why some countries moved ahead from a consolidated industrial leader, or why countries, why, for instance, the US overtook Britain at some point in the early 20th century. And also he tried to answer why some countries fall behind. So basically he examined those questions in this very famous article. And focusing on the first point about the reasons behind catching up, he mentioned it, Abramovich mentioned it, that late commerce, I mean, these countries that are relatively poor at some point, have some advantage. So they have a lot of potential to grow, basically because they have an income gap relative to countries that already developed a technology that could propel economic growth in these late commerce economies. So because these countries that are relatively poor, they have a bad load of unexploited technologies, so they have a lot of potential to grow. Basically, the only thing that they need to do is essentially to embrace, to adopt these technologies that were already created. So the question is why that doesn't happen. So why this is not a generalized trend? So why we don't see that essentially late commerce or relatively poor countries have these economic miracles? Well, because we have that convergence of that accelerated economic growth or transition is determined by what Abramovich called social capabilities. So basically, what we have in practicality is not just absolute convergence, but what we have is conditional convergence. So there are certain preconditions that countries need to have in order to adopt or to embrace these unexploited technologies that already exist. And the social capability, so this is a very ambiguous concept, is essentially right institutions, a financial sector, and certain preconditions that we can um, maybe examine how these social capabilities were achieved by Latin American countries during this period in order to understand the economic convergence. Okay, so examining properly the evolution of the Latin American income per capita relative to the industrial leader of the world, that we can assume that was Britain. So in this figure, I show you the income per capita for these 6 countries in Latin America relative to that of Britain. So basically, what we can see here is that in the 1817, Argentina accounted for around the 40% of the British GDP. We see a tremendous improvement here. So there is an important increase in Argentina relative income per capita. So Argentina moved from a 40% in the late 19th century toward more than 70% in 1913. So there was a tremendous improvement. So this is impressive. But that didn't stop there. So we see an additional relative gain, and in 1928, I mean 1 year before the Great Depression, Argentina's GDP, relative GDP was around 80%. I mean, relative to that of Britain. So this is a a really good example of economic convergence. Totally similar, but less intense, occurred in Chile. So in the case of Chile, so we see this great improvement here. So Chile moved from a little bit more than 30% to 60%. So this is what it say that we have growth across the whole continent, but that economy or that growth was more intense in the case of the southern countries. Something interesting occurred in the case of Venezuela. So in the case of Venezuela, you can see that Venezuela started from a position similar to that of Chile or Argentina, but something happened in the case of Venezuela that couldn't continue growing in the late 19th century, even that his convergence trend was resumed in the early 20th century, but obviously there is a divergence at regional level between Argentina and Venezuela, or between Chile and Venezuela. Then we have the cases of Mexico and Colombia, where this transition or where this convergence was more gradual. In the case of Colombia, so that was more obvious in the 20s, not very much in the late 19th century. And finally, we have the case of Brazil. So in the case of Brazil, Brazil didn't experience a substantial or a significant economic growth in the late 19th century. So we explore a little bit the reason behind that in our previous lecture that focused on Brazil. But in general terms, so there is some progress. So we are interested not just in seeing the Latin American countries' relative performance, but also in see the evolution of Latin American countries. I mean, the evolution of their income per capita. And I think that an interesting comparison that we can do is to contrast the case of Latin America with, for instance, the case of Germany and also the case of Canada. So why Germany and why Canada? Well, because Germany is the canonical example of economic convergence in the 19th century for economic historians. So usually when we examine or when we study the concept of backwardness, how a country that was relatively poor converged with the industrial leader. So Germany is a good example for that. I mean, the case of Germany in the 19th century. So what we can see is that Argentina and Chile have an evolution similar to that of Germany in this period. So consider that we are talking about Germany in the late 19th century. So we have this idea that Germany was doing super well. And what we can see is that, for instance, the income per capita in the case of Argentina was slightly higher in the early 20th century than that of Germany. Also, we can contrast the evolution of the Latin American countries with the case of Canada. So why Canada? Because Canada is a peripheral economy with endowments similar to this of what we observe in Latin America. I mean, so large endowment of natural resource and a relatively small population. Also, Canada experiencing an important, an impressive economic growth in the late 19th century. And what we can see is that at least Chile and Argentina are displaying a similar evolution in his growth path. Something happened in the case of Venezuela that Venezuela diverged. We have no the complete answer about why Venezuela didn't follow Argentina and Chile, but something to consider, and we will see that later, is the integration into global capital markets. So I think that a problem that Venezuela could have here is that due to political instability, that country went into default and couldn't continue receiving capital inflows or essentially foreign investment like the case of Argentina and Chile. Now, let's review countries that didn't do particularly well. So basically, in the first figure, so we examine this country that show with the best performance in terms of economic convergence. But now let's see the case of countries that didn't do particularly well. So we have the case of Mexico, where what you have is a more gradual transition from a stagnation toward more economic growth. Also, we have the case of Colombia. So Colombia started from a very low base. Basically, what you have in Colombia is an stagnation for the whole 19th century. And something happened in the early 20th century that country moved into modern economic growth, into the modern economic growth era. So again, so we have the case of Brazil that have probably one of the lowest economic growth rates during this period. So what we have is that economic growth for the whole continent, but more intense in some countries than in others. Okay, so now let's explore the different mechanisms how the global economic history, or sorry, the global economy could have an impact on the national economies in Latin America. And the first potential channel is, of course, international trade. So there are different mechanisms or different ways how economies are integrated, and of course trade is one important way how you have that economic integration. So the first thing to consider here is that we have an expansion of international trade in the late 19th century. So this is why we describe this period at global level like the first period of globalization. And a substantial part of that increase in international trade is explained by innovation in transportation that have an impact in transportation costs. So what we have here is that you have an important, a substantial decline in transportation costs that essentially make feasible exporting commodities at a large level. So what we have now is that exporting commodities that accounted for a large volume or I mean that occupy a large volume in transportation, but his price were relatively low. So now that was feasible. So one of the reasons why, for instance, during the colonial period, when we studied the Spanish Empire, so we saw that the sporting sector was specialized in exporting gold and silver, was because the value of these commodities was very high relative to their volume. So what we have now is another kind of exporting sector, essentially with relatively low value commodities, but that now they could be exported due to the improvement in transportation that we observed in the late 19th century. So falling transportation costs is essential to understand this increase at global level in international trade. Also, there was an increase in the demand for commodities as a result of the increase in the income in the core economy. So what we have is that the average person in Europe or in North America now have a higher disposable income, and therefore that that population increases their demand for commodities from not just from Latin America, but from different regions across the world. So we have the improvement in transportation. We have an increase in disposable income, particularly in the core economies. Also, we have that the industrial leader at the time that was Britain was committed with a free trade policy. So all that facilitated the increase in international trade. So how can we measure globalization in terms of trade? Well, we can see the evolution of the exported goods as a share of the GDP. So we can notice essentially that the level of integration in terms of trade was higher in the late 19th century relative to the level that we observed for the interwar period, and also the case that the case after after World War II. So we saw a resumption of globalization in the most recent period, but we only see that after the 1980s. So it took a while observe again the level of market integration that we saw for the late 19th century. So just to illustrate the fall in transportation costs, so let me bring your attention to this pain from the Battle of Trafalgar. So it was at the time probably one of the most relevant battle in Europe. So you can assume that countries involved in this conflict sent the best of their fleets to this battle. And what we can see here is that sailing was the predominant technology in navigation. So you can see that the cutting edge technology at that time so was essentially sailing for navigation. If we contrast that, I mean, the Battle of Trafalgar is from 1805. If we contrast that with the late 19th century, so we saw we see the development of steam navigation. So in just a matter of 80 years. So we see how transportation evolved and how steam navigation consolidated. So of course that have a tremendous impact in the fall of transportation costs. So technology also opened the window of opportunity for a more integrated world economy. Also, it was not just about steam navigation. So it was also steam in road transportation via railroad. So we have here a pain from the first intercity railroad in the world that was the Liverpool and Manchester route. That railway is from the early 19th century, but what we'll see is that gradually throughout the 19th century, that technology was adopted for different countries and also for countries in Latin America. And of course, that made feasible exporting commodities at a large volume. Okay, so now we have thought about the evolution of international trade, but now let's break down that at regional level. So let's examine how well Latin America was doing relative to the rest of the world, or at least relative to Western Europe. And what we can see here is that merchandise export as a share of the GDP was lower in the case of Latin America if we compare with Western Europe, but that measurement was higher during the export-led growth period that of the second half of the 20th century. So we see a reduction in international trade or in the level of Latin American integration into the world economy in the if we contrast the late 19th, early 20th century with the following period, I mean the second half of the 20th century. So Latin America was more integrated into the world economy, even that was not at the same level that the Western Europe was. But if we compare Latin America with other regions beyond Western Europe, say United States and Asia. So what we can see here is that the level of integration was substantially larger in Latin America. So you can notice that, for instance, in the case of the US, that measurement was only higher than that of Latin America after World War II. So it was just in the second half of the 20th century that we see that North America was more integrated into the world economy than Latin America. So I think that probably the takeaway here is that even that the level of integration was not that of Western Europe. So Latin America was very well integrated into the world economy. So it was not a marginal player in the first wave of globalization. So it was a very important player. This is, of course, a regional average. So we are aggregating the whole region. Of course, there are substantial difference between countries. So some countries experiencing a higher increase in their exports per capita. So that was the case of Argentina. That you can notice how exports per capita increased between 1870 and 1912. We can contrast the case of Argentina, for instance, with the case of Colombia, that it was much more moderate increase. So Colombia have a mild increase in the late 19th century, but that was reversed in the early 20th century. So the Latin America was very well integrated into the world economy, but we have difference between countries. So that would be another point to consider. So another thing to bear in mind here is that we have mentioned that the sporting sector was important to understand the export growth. And we have mentioned that Latin America was a relevant player, was not a marginal player. Also, we wanted to know how Latin America was integrated into this global trade network. And that table, this table, sorry, could be useful to understand the kind of integration that Latin America was experiencing. What we have here is that Western Europe essentially imported. We have the trade balance here. So this is what we insert here in this table. So we see what countries are exporting and what countries are importing. And what we have here is that essentially Western Europe is importing commodities or primary goods. And the main the supply for that demand came from Latin America. So Latin Americans have positive trade balance in primary products because it's exporting a lot of commodities, and Latin America at the same time is importing a lower value, a substantially lower value of commodities. So this is essential to understand the kind of integration. So we have that these countries are exporting commodities and they are importing manufacturers. So they are importing industrialized goods Not because they have no an industrial sector, it's because that industrial sector is not well consolidated yet. So we will see in 1 minute that already in the late in 19th century, so the secondary sector or the manufacturing sector accounted for a substantial share of the industrial composition, but uh, that industry couldn't compete at international level. So in understanding how Latin America is integrated into the world economy, so we can summarize like Latin America is exporting commodities and is essentially importing manufacturers. As I mentioned before, so there was an specialization not just in commodities, but in very few commodities. And this is what we can infer from this table. So for instance, we have that in the case of Bolivia, so two minerals, tin and silver, accounted for more than the 70% of his exports in 1913. Something similar happened, for instance, in the case of Brazil, where coffee and rubber accounted for almost 80% of his exports. So we have a concentration not just in commodities, but in very few commodities. So that is an important element to bear in mind. There was a concentration not just in the kind of goods that Latin America was exporting, but also in destinations. And this is what we have in this table, that most of export went into Western Europe and North America. So of course we have difference across country. We have that South America was probably more integrated with Britain, and Mexico and Central America was more integrated with the US. So you can see that, for instance, in the early 20th century, over 75% of Mexican export went into the North America or into the US market, and that contrasts, for instance, with the case of Bolivia, where over 80% of his export went into Britain. So you have a difference between countries, but we have a concentration in the destinations. Basically, this is a south-north kind of globalization. So is concentrated not just in terms of the kind of goods, but also in the destination. Okay, as I mentioned before, so we have emphasized about how commodities, how the primary sector was relevant in all this story, but also there is a discussion that it's not evident that the export-led growth model was a constraint for the development of the manufacturing sector. So we have this very influential chapter that I mentioned before by Salbucci, that he titled that chapter like export-led industrialization. And basically the idea is that the surplus generated by the sporting sector create the conditions for the early stage of industrialization. So what we can see here is the share of the secondary sector. So basically that would be the manufacturing sector on the industrial composition. And what we can see here is that, for instance, in the case of Argentina, the secondary sector accounted for around 22% of the industrial composition by the turn of the century. That share increased up to 30% in 1935. So that was almost at the same level that the primary sector. So we usually see this period like Latin American economies were essentially agrarian economies, but once you consider not just the export sector, but also the total economy, so the story is more complicated. So basically, what was probably going on here, as I mentioned it before, is that you have relevant industrial sector, but that couldn't compete at international level. So basically, that industrial sector was orientated to national markets. Finally, in examining the role of international trade in explaining the export growth, so we can consider the barter terms, so how high or low international commodity price were during this period. You have again difference between countries because the kind of commodity that each country exported was different. So in general, you have a coffee boom in the late 19th century, and this is why you see that the term of trade was better for Brazil and Colombia in the late 19th century. But you see that, for instance, in the case of Argentina and in the case of Chile, that was not the case. So this is because Argentina was exporting a different kind of commodities, especially beef, that have a different international price that, for instance, does of coffee. And also in the case of Chile, it was different because Chile was exporting essentially nitrate, other minerals, and the terms of trade were different also. Okay, so now let's examine the second potential mechanism or the second channel, how Latin American economies were integrated into the world economy. That channel is foreign investment. So financial integration is another side of globalization. So a little bit of context before to examine the case of Latin America. What we have in the 19th century in terms of the conditions before that increase in financial integration is that you have a lot of liquidity in international markets. So what you have is that because industrialization, Britain accumulated a lot of capital surplus, and that money was available to be invested in the rest of the world. So that is an important precondition to understand this integration in financial terms. So you have liquidity, you have the consolidation of the classical gold standard. So that I mean, the classical gold standard is essential to understand the first wave of globalization because that reduced the currency risk. So for countries in the core, it was less risky to invest in peripheral countries because you have the guarantee that several of these countries joined the gold standard. So if you were investing, for instance, in a railroad in Chile, and your investment was associated or what fits or what was in gold, so you face you are not worried about depreciation because you have a fixed exchange rate. And another important point to consider is that Latin America have a demand for credit. And that demand for credit comes from the fact that the domestic saving rates were very low. So because the whole problems during the early 19th century, most of Latin American countries couldn't develop a proper financial sector. So you have very low saving rates. So without saving, you have no you have no a proper financial sector. So the only way to, for instance, to funding very costly infrastructure projects like railroads was via foreign investment. So there was not just the liquidity, the supply for of credit, but also there was the demand for credit. So foreign investment was a way to overcome this constraint of low saving rates. And as you can infer, so a substantial share of that credit was used to build railroads. So the demand for credit was not just to funding the government the government expenditure, but also to funding these large-scale projects like the construction of railroads. So let's measure the level of financial integration. And what we have here is the foreign access of 9 industrialized countries. So that comes from a very influential article by Olsfeld and Taylor that basically we have no the global foreign access in this measurement. Well, we can assume that only industrialized countries or countries that achieved certain level of development have the surplus necessary to invest in the rest of the world. So I would say that this measurement is a good approximation to uh, to um, to examine at a first glance um, the level of financial integration um, in, in the last 2 centuries. And what we can see here is that very similar to what happened with international trade, there is a decline in the level of financial integration. So there is a reduction in foreign access between the early 20th century and the interwar period, and during the second wave of globalization that started in the 1980s, is that you see a resumption in the level of integration, at least in terms of financial integration. So the takeaway, Latin American economies, or not all Latin American economies, but we will see 1 minute that Latin American economies also were part of this, were integrated into the world economy, not just via international trade, but also via capital markets. The main player in terms of foreign investment was Britain, because the reason that we mentioned it before, because industrialization, Britain accumulated a lot of capital surpluses that were available to be invested into the rest of the world. Also, because an important destination of that investment was the construction of railroads. It happened that Britain is a relatively small country, so once you have built the main routes connecting the main cities, say Manchester with London or London with Birmingham, you have fewer options. So the potential for new railroads is constrained by geography, and that means that the new lines have lower returns. So this is why probably British investors were interested in building railroads beyond Britain, and Latin America was an opportunity for that. So we have large territories in most of countries, very poor connections. So the return for that investment was probably high. So Britain was the main player in terms of foreign investment. If you compare with other countries like France and Germany, so what you have is that Britain accounted for around 40% of the global foreign investment during the first era of globalization. Because that we wanted to know the destination of that investment, and what we can see is that Latin America was an important destination for the British investment. So you can see that, for instance, Argentina, Brazil, but also Chile and Mexico accounted for a substantial share of the British overseas investment. So I think that we are talking that Latin America was an important player, not just because international trade, but also was an important player in the global capital market. So I think that that would be the second the second takeaway that we can have from this lecture. Now focusing only in peripheral countries, so basically excluding the core economies, we can see that the relative relevance of Latin America is more visible, is more evident. Basically, around the half of the British foreign investment went into the peripheral economies, and the half of that half went into Latin America. So countries like, for instance, Argentina accounted for 22% of British investment in peripheral countries. So that share was substantial. A comparison that I think that for me is very relevant to understand this period is comparing the case of Chile. I mean, Chile is a peripheral economy with a relatively small population, with the case of Japan. So Japan have a larger population, but in terms of foreign investment or in terms of British foreign investment, they have a relatively similar level. So Japan accounted for around 5% of the total British investment in peripheral countries, and Chile accounted for 4%. So they are in a relatively similar level, even that we are talking about two very different countries. So in the of course the population of Japan is by far larger than that of Chile. So again, so we all the empirical evidence point out that Latin America was an important player, even that we can include Latin America, we can class Latin America in the peripheral countries. So it was an important destination for for the for foreign investment, and particularly for British investment. Also, we wanted to know not only capital flows, but also how that capital was allocated. And again, we will see a difference between countries. So I will see is that in the case of Uruguay and Argentina, railroads accounted for a larger share of the foreign investment. On the contrary, we see the case of Peru, where most of foreign investment or most of capital inflows went into funding the government expenditure. So probably we wanted to know not just the magnitude of capital inflows, but also how that money was spent. And as you can infer, so financial integration was relevant. No, not just because because government have options to funding his debt, but also it was essential to funding a transportation infrastructure, and of course that have an impact on international trade. So we have assumed until now that international trade is a mechanism different from foreign investment. But in practicality, there is an overlap, there is a connection between the two. So if foreign investment and improvement in transportation facilitated, made possible exporting commodities at a large volume. We have a good example here. This is the Argentina rail network in the early 20th century. So what we can see here is that essentially Buenos Aires, the capital city, is well connected with the rest of the country. So we have a consolidated, a large rail network. Of course, Argentina is the most known case, but that expansion of railroads was not constrained, it was not limited to the case of Argentina. So we have I will come back to that 1 second. We have also an expansion of the railway to in the case of Chile, and also in the case of Mexico. But in general terms, in Latin America, we see an expansion of railroads that is quite connected with the large expansion of foreign investment, capital inflows, and particularly British investment is behind all this transformation. I show it here Argentina main station, the Estación Retiro, that basically was the main station for all these large rail network. And if you wanted to know more about British railroads in Argentina, I mean, because this is a very good case study, I strongly encourage you to take a look to this book by Professor Colin Lewis. That is an excellent description of all this process. So here you have all the elements that I have briefly described it here. Foreign investment, the how railroads expand in Argentina, and how that also opened the possibilities for sporting at a large scale. So if you are particularly interested in the case of Argentina, so I think that that would be a good reference. Also, it will be useful to contrast with other Latin American countries that didn't have the same level of expansion in their railroad networks. So this is the case of Chile, the nitrate railroad in the north of the country that was essential for exporting nitrate, this fertilizer that was at the core of the Chilean exporting sector. This is the railroad in the case, the railroad network in the case of Mexico. Also, we have in the case of Latin America that foreign investment have a ramification, have another indirect impact, and that impact was the development of a local financial sector. We mentioned at the beginning that the demand for credit was particularly large in the case of Latin America because these countries have no a proper financial sector, so they had very low saving rates in the early 19th century, and we will see that a byproduct of this integration into the world economy via capital markets will also lead to the rise of their domestic financial sector. So most of banks or the oldest banks in Latin America come from this period. So we have here a picture of the Bank of London and Rio de la Plata, because you need a administrative network in order to mobilize capital from the core toward the periphery, because you need a mechanism or you need a network to make all these transactions. So there was also a demand for this kind of institution at a local level. So we will see here also the rise of the domestic financial sector for many countries. So this is just a picture of the Bank of London and Rio de la Plata. This is a bad note from German bank in the, I think that is in Mexico. So sorry, the resolution is not the best, but yeah, but this is basically a note, a bad note from a German bank in Mexico, and this is a bad note from the Bank of Valparaiso. So I mean, during this period, also occurred the rise, or is the origin of the financial sector in Latin America, foreign investment and all the transactions that are occurring, for instance, to funding governments and railroads, explain a substantial part of that development. We have this estimation by Alan Taylor about the actual impact of foreign investment in Latin America at the end, at the end of the fair globalization. We mentioned it before that I am assuming that the fair globalization ended in Latin America later than in the rest of the world, but he considered the year before the First World War. Basically, he's measuring how would be the GDP in Latin America without foreign investment. And the relevant column here is the last one. That is basically what it showing is how smaller the Latin American GDP would be without foreign investment. So of course, that depends of the how big, how relevant foreign investment was, and what we can conclude that, for instance, in these countries where foreign investment played a key role for boosting their economic growth, for instance, the case of Argentina, um, the GDP will be substantially lower without foreign investment. So basically, what we can see here is that without foreign investment in the early 20th century, Argentina's GDP would be 30% lower. So it's a big number. So this is basically a good way to summarize the impact of foreign investment on Latin American economies. This is a figure that shows the capital flows to Latin America. And this is a reason why I think that this period or this export-led growth model in Latin America lasted up to the late 1920s, basically up to the Great Depression. Basically, what happened is that after the First World War, we have a decline in the British influence, also in the British foreign investment in the region. But that role that was played by Britain was replaced by the US. So what we have is that during the so-called Roaring 20s in American history, a substantial share of that expansion was went to Latin America. So the or to a certain extent, the 20s is the 1920s is a continuation of the fair wage globalization that started in the late 19th century. So the only thing that probably, or not the only thing, but something that probably happened here is that the role that Britain used to have in the continent was replaced by the US until the Great Depression. So we will see that the Great Depression was the tipping point in Latin American economic history in the 20th century. Basically, next week we will talk about what happened after the Great Depression. Okay, a final mechanism how the global economy impacted Latin American economies is migration. So we also need to examine the integration in terms of people mobility or in the labor market. And we will see an important increase in immigration, so basically in influx of people coming into the continent, and also having an impact in the increase in the rise of the national economies. This population is integrated into national economies in Latin America, and also is this process is propelling the growth that we are describing here, also via demand. So we have a large we have larger internal markets also in Latin America during this period, and a substantial component, a substantial share of that is explained by the rise of migration. So what we have in this table is an indicator, is a measurement of the is a ratio of migrants to 1,000 inhabitants. So well, it's a way how we can measure migration. And what we can see here is that according to this indicator, the migration rate in some countries in Latin America, particularly in Argentina, is higher than that of the US. So usually when we think in the first wave globalization, in the case of the US, we think in the mass migration, in the large um, movement of people from Europe towards North America. But what we have in Latin America is a similar process, at least in the south of the continent. An important point to consider here, just as a clarification. So in the case of Argentina, the migration rate is higher, but also it's important to consider that Argentina have a lower population. So in actual numbers, so the number of migrants is higher in the case of the US. So in the case of Argentina, so this ratio is particularly high because its population is smaller. But still, so migration is another important component of this period, of the export-led growth period. I just have a couple of pictures just to illustrate you how relevant migration was. So this is the Puerto, sorry, the Puerto Buenos Aires, the Port of Buenos Aires. This is a newspaper that circulated in English in that period. Was particularly oriented um, to to the Irish community, or to Irish migrants, the Southern Cross. Um, and again, so if you can have a consumer base for this publication, is because you have a large migrant community. I have also a couple of pictures for the case of Chile. So in the case of Chile, so this is a poster to to attract migration from Croatia. So we know that the Croatian community is an important group in the case of Chile. Also, this is a house from the south of the country, basically just to illustrate the German migration in the south of Chile. And again, so that movement of people was relevant. So even that in actual numbers is smaller than what we see for the US, is substantial relative to their national population. We want also to explain the reasons behind migration. And as you can maybe infer, so immigration, so you have push and pull reasons, elements, and the wage gap, so the difference in wage between these countries where migrants came from and the recipient countries are essential to understand the difference. What we have here is that a substantial share of the migrants coming to Latin America came from the south of Europe. So what we have in this table is essentially the wage gap between an average of Italy, Portugal, and Spain. If we compare that gap with the wage in Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Cuba, Mexico, and Uruguay. And what we have here is that migrants were going to Argentina, at least from the south of Europe, because they expected higher wage there. Also, something similar happened in the case of Uruguay. And eventually in the case of Colombia, so there was a convergence. So the wages in Colombia were lower, also because the economic growth in Colombia was not particularly good in the late 19th century. So we talked before about Colombia's stagnation, but eventually that wage gap was closing. So I think that we need to stop here. Yeah, so what I'm going to do is that I'm going to allow the remaining of the class in another video in the afternoon. So thank you for the moment. Let's stop here. I don't know if there is any question that we can answer in these last minutes.
Yes, Ivan, there was one prior question that was not answered about the effects of the War of the Pacific on the economic growth in Chile. So did it positively affect?
Yeah, I think that this is an important point. So I mentioned it before that we have a decline in wars in the second half of the 19th century relative to the early 19th century. But of course, the Pacific War is important. So in the case of Chile, yeah, definitely. So there is an important impact because a lot of the mineral exports came from that region that used to be part of Bolivia and Peru. So the nitrate is at the core of the Chilean exporting sector. And after the war, so Chile have access to this deposit. So that have probably a positive impact in the case of Chile, but of course a negative impact in the case of Peru and Bolivia, not just because the direct loss from the war, but also because all the political and institutional stability that came as a result of the war.
One theme that arose out of many questions is about political stability and its effect on economic growth in the long run. So you cover more or less kind of what we can call proximate causes through migration, trade, and foreign investment. But what was the role of institutions?
Institutions are essential to understand these periods. This is what I mentioned at the beginning. So, as you say, so we cover here the the proximal or the visible reasons behind economic growth, but the ulterior reasons or the structural reasons to understand that. So we need to explore institutions. So I have that part at the end of the lecture, but just to answer that question right now. So what we have is an improvement at the institutional level in terms that you have a higher centralization of power. So you have no all the disorder or instability proper from the early 19th century. But we have not the same improvement in terms of check and balance. So what we have is that political power is concentrated, but the fragility of the problem is that you have for instance an increase in constraints to executive power. So you have a check and balance, for instance, between the parliament and the executive, that eventually will be a problem in order to build a credible commitment and to establish a model in the or yeah, a model of stability for the long run. So we say that there was also some improvement, but that improvement was concentrated just in decentralization of power and not in building what Acemoglu and Robinson called inclusive institutions. So I think that there was some development, but stopped somewhere in between.
Second theme in the questions is about inequality. So you have covered kind of the effects on the economy as a whole, but how were these effects between the many classes within the Latin American countries? So did this contribute to people becoming richer, or it contribute to everybody becoming richer?
I think that this is a very relevant discussion. And again, so we will have relevant difference between countries. In general terms, it seems like inequality is quite persistent in Latin America, regardless the business cycle. So what you have here is that you have economic growth. So some people became richer. So I think that the average person became richer. So we have moderate economic growth. But I think that the transformation that we experienced here was not enough to lead to a more yeah, to reduce inequality. So I think that the transformative power was not big enough to substantially reduce income inequalities that have historical roots in the case of Latin America. An important thing about inequality is that we will see that, for instance, in the 20th century, inequality, at least in few countries, will be very associated to financial crisis. We will see that, unfortunately, in Latin American history, financial crises are very recurrent. So we have every 10, 20 years a financial crisis. And what you see is an increase in inequality after the crisis. And that is probably associated with the performance of the labor market. But broadly speaking, what we have during the export-led growth model is that we have an improvement for everybody, but the relative position didn't change very much.
Were there some heterogeneous effects in terms of what commodities exports were being exported, like what in terms of financial integration? So, like for example, beef and wheat in Argentina versus guano and rubber in Peru.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point. So you can think that some commodities, for instance, have more linkage with the manufacturing sector or favorite, for instance, the development of transportation infrastructure. I would answer that question, for instance, contrasting the case of Argentina and Chile. So, for instance, what you see in Chile is that because the mining sector and the commodities that are being exported are located mainly in the north of the country. So there is a lot of investment in that particular region. So railroads or the first railroads in Chile are mainly located in the north of the country because the target is exporting nitrate that is allocated in the north of the country. But in the case of Argentina, because the capital city is at the same time the country's main port, so you have a more integrated transportation infrastructure. So what you have is that in this case, the rise of the exporting sector is also having a positive effect in the internal market integration. We say that it's not just the kind of commodity, is also the geography behind commodities. So something similar is happening in Colombia. So the coffee growing region that is in the west of the country. So you will see that transportation infrastructure, transportation investment will be more concentrated in that region. So that also, for instance, have an impact on inequality. So relating that with the previous points. So for instance, in the case of Colombia, you will have the rise of the west of the country, a relative decline of the east of the country, because as a result of the commodity exporting era, so the transportation investment is concentrated particularly in that region of the country.
A final question is about comparing Latin America, or particularly South America, with the Mediterranean countries, because you did comparisons with North America and Northern Europeans. But given that there was migration from these Mediterranean countries to South America, then it must have been that at this point in time, Latin America was a bit richer, at least. So how does that?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. So in this lecture, we talked about convergence. That was one of the main points. Next, we will talk about divergence. So basically, what happened in Latin America, that the 20th century was not the best century. And one of the comparisons that we will do is essentially contrasting how in the early 20th century we can compare Latin America with the south of Europe, and the divergence that we observe today essentially is something that came from the 20th century. So in terms of the Mediterranean countries, or these countries from the south of Europe, so we can assume that depends of the country. So basically, if we compare, say, Spain or Portugal with Argentina, so we can infer that, of course, the income per capita in Argentina was substantially higher. But if we compare Portugal, Spain, Italy with Colombia, so in the case of in that comparison, so the income per capita for the Mediterranean countries would be higher. So it depends on the country, but something that is probably important to understand the whole migration process is the endowment in each geography. So what you have in Latin America or in South America is essentially a large extension of territory. So you have a large potential for the agricultural sector. And what you have in the south of Europe is that the agricultural sector couldn't compete with the agricultural sector in America. Not just with Latin America, but also I'm talking about the US and Canada. So the agricultural sector in these countries were facing a really hard time during the first era of globalization. And migration was an option for the population that used to work in that sector. What you have in Latin America is just the opposite endowment. So you have large territory, a relatively small population. What you have in the south of Europe, in that particular context, and talking about the population that used to work in the agricultural sector, is a lot of unemployment because the agricultural sector couldn't compete in the global market. And what you have is a surplus of labor that eventually could reallocate in Latin America.
Okay, thank you very much, Ivan. Thank you very much, everybody. We will continue with this topic next Thursday. We will have Catalina Vizcarra, professor at the University of Vermont. She will talk more or less about commodity booms in the guano sector, which was very important in the late 19th century. And thank you very much. See you next time.